I wanted to start out by explaining why we're doing this today. Back a few months ago, we've been talking for over a year, probably a couple of years here, of having the Great Law reading done here, and we wanted it sanctioned by the Grand Council as well, and we didn't want to. We thought it was important for all of our nations to be involved with it, and so we had a meeting several months ago here, and we were discussing about how that was going to happen, and who was going to do it, and who has the capacity today to do the recital of the Great Law. And of course, most of the nations were represented. They sent someone here, one of the chiefs probably from most of our nations. I don't think all the longhouses were represented, but most of the nations were. And when we were attempting to figure it out, who was going to do what, in the midst of that discussion, towards the end of it, they were asking if there could be a piece done. One of the chiefs had asked if we could do a piece on decolonization before the Great Law recital, because we had to. One of the concerns was we had to figure out, or at least have a discussion about, why we are not more proactive about learning. What is in the way of our culture? What is in the way of our teachings? And certainly, since 1492, there's been a lot of stuff in the way of our culture. Has been invading our culture, our traditions, our way of life, our communities, all of that stuff. And we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to do my best to try and give you an overview of that. I may spend some time talking about specific things that I think that are important for us to understand, so that we walk away from here with some idea of why probably over the last 100 years, our culture has been at risk of loss. There was a time in 1950s, it kind of peaked there, the loss. There was only a few people. In the 1960s, there was a recovery process, and then into the 70s, it seemed to recover. At least people were starting to learn it more. And then it seems to dissipate again in the late 80s. We haven't had a real recital of the Great Law, I guess officially by the Confederacy, probably for, I think they were saying, over 20 years. And we have to really ask our question, why? Why is that? You know, do we know that much about it that we don't have to listen to it? You know, is that a fair assumption to make? Or is it something that is so strict, we have a hard time listening to it? It could be that too as well. But certainly, I mean, we as a Haudenosaunee, as people of the Longhouse, we've been trying to, we've been keeping our culture pretty strong, I think, over the last 30, 40 years. When you look across the Confederacy, across our territories, you see amazing things going on. Certainly, one of the things that's really an example of our colonization is the fact that we need language programs in our community. The loss of language is really one of the benchmarks of the colonization. And it's one of the things that has been at most risk in most of our communities. And there are a lot of efforts going on across the Confederacy that are changing that. And I think I want to speak about that later on too, because I think we really need to honor those efforts as well. The other thing is, I think that's important to recognize too when we look at across the Confederacy, is the fact that there are a number of longhouses that are in a way that are not recognized by the Grand Council, but are holding ceremonies. And that's been a growing phenomenon. If you look at, you just heard it, about Wata, has a longhouse. They're doing ceremonies. They're practicing our teachings. Tuscarora, longhouse, community, traditions, practicing our teachings. Those are two examples. And in the last 10 years or so, we've seen the acknowledgement of the longhouse in Wisconsin by the Confederacy, and a fire extended to that community. So we have expanded our territories. We've expanded and accepted and drew more people into the Confederacy as a result of that, and we need to continue doing that. But why do we stall? Why do it seems like we're going really well for 10, 20 years, 30 years, and all of a sudden we stall. We stall and we put the brakes on, and we put it in neutral, and we just start gliding along. And basically over the last 20 years we've been gliding along in terms of the recovery of probably one of the, not probably, but this is one of our key defining pieces of our culture that define who we are as a people. The Kain Lagoa is that piece that really defines and sets our culture on a mission, on a direction for our survival and our contribution to the world community. When you look at our teachings around peace, skana, when you look at our teachings around that, those teachings alone are what define us as a people and how we have been integrating them into our way of life. And those teachings are what defines us as people, makes us very different from other people in the world community. Even from other indigenous cultures, it makes us very different from other indigenous cultures. And it is that piece that we're going to be talking about all this week. And I think it's really, we should engage these teachings with a sense of joy about ourselves. That we're still able to do that. And yeah, we're going to be piecemealing it together, this speaker, that speaker, and all of that. I think in the past, the last time I remember I heard one speaker go through it for 7 days in the 1970s. And we had speakers that could do that. Today it's a little bit, we need to work together to be able to do that, and we're going to do that. We've got people coming in from all the different nations who are going to help put this together. And I think that itself also speaks loudly about who we are as Haudenosaunee, that we can all come together to be able to do this. So when we were having this discussion a few months ago, one of the chiefs says, well, we should have this piece on decolonization so we can start looking at this. Looking at what is in the way of our learning, what is in the way of us being who we are. I mean, we're pretty strong about our character, about being Ongwahome or about being Haudenosaunee. We're pretty strong about that. But there are things that are pretty obvious out there that are in our way of being fully practicing our teachings. And that's what we want to take a look at. This first symbol that I used up here is really off the letterhead of the Haudenosaunee, and that represents the 50 chiefs and represents all of our clans. And the symbol of the Great Tree of Peace, the four roots, all of that is the teachings that come. And that's been the logo probably has been on our letterhead of the Confederacy and most of the nation councils probably for over 40 years. So I think that I remember back in those discussions about how we wanted to pick something that was really going to represent who we are as a people. So the purpose of this particular session is to help people understand what has impacted the Haudenosaunee over the last, since 1492, to look at how we can remove some of the damage in our world that blocks our learning, and to look at how important these original teachings are to us as a people and for our future. We need to look at those things. And we need to understand that there are very specific things that are in our way that block our ability to learn. And we want to take a look at that too. I think that historically we've been given a lot of information about this, even in our teachings, but I think it's important to wrestle through it even today and taking a new perspective around it. So firstly is, what is colonization? How do we view it? I simply say it's the invasion of Turtle Island. We have these Europeans that are coming here, they invade our territory, and it's not people coming on a vacation here. You know, I mean, these are people who are relentless in coming to take our territory. This is when they landed here, what came first into our territories, even though they landed on the coast, what came into our territories first were the diseases that they carried. And as far as we've been able to determine, there's been 11 major plagues that have spread across the country. Everything from the common cold, smallpox, on up. There's been a series of diseases. And out of those 11 diseases, we are plagued with them yet today. When you look at diabetes, it is one of those diseases that comes from a part of that invasion. So we are still being invaded by germ warfare, you might say it, throughout our communities. And when you look at the impact of diabetes and heart disease and all of that today, and also one of the things that became critical in the late 1700s was the alcoholism. Alcoholism was running rampant by the late 1800s. And certainly we received a message about that and what that was going to do to our communities, and we'll take a look at that too as well. But I think it's important to recognize, before we even seen any white men, we were dying from their diseases. And it was a difficult period of time from that period on. So from 1600, where they say that our first contact with the white people was around 1604. And when you look at that period of time for the first 200 years, we were basically at a funeral for 200 years. Could you imagine going to a funeral every week for 200 years, generation after generation of our people dying from diseases? And that's basically was our initial experience with the invasion. So when you look at that amount of death that we faced, and that doesn't include the wars that took place after, but just from the diseases. And you look at the amount of mourning that we were going through. What did we have to do in order to survive that? And that's really a question that we have to ask ourselves today. How did we survive that? What did we instill in ourselves to be able to survive that period of time? What did our ancestors do? And what did they pass on to us in order to instill us a sense of survival as a people? So with the invasion, this was a system of oppression. It was forced on our people as the invasion came in. You have to remember that the people that are invading us, they come with an attitude that they think they are better than us. And when they looked at us as not being human beings. That was their perspective. And so here we were, people, because we were not Christian, And that was one of the defining principles of the invaders. If you weren't Christian, you weren't human. And if you weren't human, then we could destroy you. And if we could destroy you, we could conquer you. And if we can conquer you, we can own your land. And that is basically the summary of the invasion. Their attitude was that they came and looked at us, and because of the way we lived, the way we conducted ourselves, and we were considered subhuman. And a lot of their doctrine that they still use today in the court system, it still says the same thing. So as I had mentioned, as a colonized, I mean, here we are, our ancestors, 200 years into this, as we get colonized, we are suddenly experiencing a change in ourselves. And some of this is that we are made to think that we are entirely alone in our own universe. That is one of the things that come out of the oppression. At the individual level, colonized people learn to hide their real feelings and sincere beliefs because they have been taught that their beliefs and feelings are evidence of ignorance or of being a barbarian. And so when you look at, here is somebody coming at us who has this ethnocentric attitude that they are better than us, and so they treat us that way over and over again for over 400 years now, and to a point where they create these institutions that instill that into our people. And one of those institutions is the residential schools or the boarding schools on the American side. Those institutions were primarily there to dehumanize us as a people, to steal our language, to destroy our families, and to destroy us as a people and to destroy our culture. And you have to remember that that was their intent. They didn't do it as a mistake. I remember earlier on, maybe 20 years ago, people would talk about residential schools and all of that, and they would say, oh, they were just do-gooders, they were trying to help educate us, and they made a mistake, by trying to get rid of our language. They were just doing the best they could. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. Their intent was to destroy our culture and to destroy us as a people. Don't ever think that different about that history. The real history is that they were here to destroy us as a people. And that was their intent. So here we are. I mean, when we adjust to all of that, all of this death and dying that's going on in our world during that period of time, we had to hide our feelings. We had to hide our beliefs about who we were. Some of you may remember maybe a generation ago or 2 generations ago, our people, if they were traditional, they always practiced, maybe went to church every once in a while, just to let the community know, that we're okay. We kind of we're over there, but they kept their traditional stuff over here, kept it hidden in most cases, and didn't want anybody to know that they might be a barbarian, And but that was the way it was, A generation ago, or even 2 generations ago, it was probably even worse than that. Everyone hid their traditionalism because they didn't want to be persecuted for being who they were. And there were those who openly practiced, and they were ostracized. Oh, they were over there. That's those longhouse people over there. And they were pushed over in a corner over there, or they were thought to be other or being different. And that even by our own people. Our own people thought of that, of their own relatives that way. And so our teachings and our religion began to divide our communities. And that's really one of the struggles that we have today, is because we have many divisions in our communities today, and it's really the result of this invasion, this breaking up of who we were, and us collectively owning our identity as Haudenosaunee. Because that's who we really are. Nobody can erase that. We are all Ongwahonwe. And it doesn't matter how many Bibles you stack on top of that, you are still Ongwahonwe. You know, but we try to use those teachings against each other. And I think that's one of the damages that we've seen in our community, is this internal conflict that exists between our various communities. And it comes out of this invasion. So we come out of it in that invasion with a lack of self-confidence or a fear of action. We have a fear of taking ownership of who we are and taking action against the invasion and the invaders. We have a tendency to believe that the ravages and pain of colonization are somehow deserved. When you think about that, and I've seen this when we've been doing healing programs and that, people believe that they deserve to be in pain. They deserve to be punished for being who they are. And that's the reality of the colonization. You know, and it's sad that we have come to that state. So the victims of colonization in certain cases blame themselves for all the pain that they have suffered. So historically, that's probably the cruelest part of the colonization, is that they blame us until we take the blame and blame ourselves for the suffering and the pain and the hurt that exists in our world. And really it has come from that invasion. And so there really needs to be a way to cleanse that. One of the things I wanted to kind of focus on around the invasion is because I think one of the things that, if you ever get a chance to read anything or study any of this, look for this doctrine of discovery. Google it on the internet or whatever, but I mean, there's a lot of the indigenous nations in North and Central and South America have been advocating to get this doctrine removed, or I don't know what you call it, dispelled, or get the institution that created it. Because the primary agency that's responsible for the doctrine of discovery is the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has been the one that has initiated this document. And this document of discovery, or document of discovery is old. Some say it goes back at least 700 years. You know, that they've been creating pieces of it. And over the years we've added to it, you know, like the British added a piece to it. And that we can take a look at that. But each of these pieces was designed, one is to take our land. And that's been the primary focus of the invasion, is to take our land away from us. And if you look at all the land claim stuff that's been going on, I mean, even our nation's been involved in the land claims in New York State until a few years ago when the courts finally threw it out, said you don't have no claim because you took too long to come to the court. You know, and which is really ridiculous because you couldn't go to court. But anyways, that's a whole other story. I can go off on a tangent on that. But but when you look at the claims, Indian claims, I mean, here we are as the original people of this land, and we're laying claim, making a claim to our own territory. I mean, each one of our nations had millions of acres. Oneida's had 6 million acres in upstate New York. Imagine 6 million acres of land. And what's in our possession today? Probably, maybe, for all of Oneida's, probably 20, 30,000 acres that we own today, or that we have possession of. But historically, we owned up until at least, say, 1794, since the Canandaigua Treaty. Up until that point, we had access to 6 million acres. In 1794, they shrunk it down to a 250,000 acre reservation in 1794 of our 6 million acres. And when you look at that, and how did they do that? Well, we discovered it. And you didn't have possession of it because you're an immigrant too. That's why they always use the Bering Strait theory. You know, the Bering Strait theory was proposed because they wanted to define us as immigrants to this land too, that we weren't indigenous to this land, that we migrated here just like all the buffalo and deer and all the other animals. So we migrated here, and because we migrated here, we didn't have possession of the land. We just got here just before the white man showed up. You know, maybe about 10,000 years before, but just before they got here. You know, and we didn't even have a chance to build a house yet. I mean, that's their argument. You know, and but in reality, when you look at it, you look at our creation story and all of our other stories, and you look at who we are, I mean, we've been here for a long, long time. But here, the doctrine of discovery is an instrument, has become an instrument, has become a legal instrument, used to continue to dispossess us of our land. And it is probably one instrument that we really have to understand that's coming a part of this invasion. And this invasion is still here. We're still being invaded. As small as our communities are, and we'll talk about that too, because I mean, we're still at risk as a culture. There are 10 points. I was one of the guys, this author named Miller. I think he's from Oklahoma, who wrote one of the first books on the doctrine of discovery. And there's about several of them out now, so you should all get a chance to read one of them. But one of the first things that they talk about is that first discovery is the European countries gained property or sovereign rights over land, claim of title without possession. So that was the first thing that they do, is that the Pope granted the kings or the queens the right to own land, property that was discovered, even if they didn't possess it. As long as they've seen it, they own it. So that was the first thing. Actual occupancy and current possession is like the building of forts. The reason for all those forts that were being built was not only for defense, but it was really put there as a marker to saying we possess this land. And usually the fort was usually put at the head of a lake or at the head of a river. So the idea of that is that if they planted something at the head of a river, everything, wherever that source of that river is, they own all of that. That is the principle of their law. So that was the reason why they built these forts. So the Pope granted the kings, and the kings granted the colonizers the power of preemption, which is the sole right to buy the land from native people. If you look at a lot of the agreements, like even in some of the treaties, it'll say that only the crown, only the crown, on this side, only the crown can buy land from Indians. An individual can't. So a settler coming in cannot buy land off an Indian, but it has to be the government or the colonizer's right arm of the king or queen that has to do the purchase. And Indian title, after discovery, indigenous people were considered to have lost their full property rights. They only retained a right to occupy and use the land. And so there are some agreements out there that people, like the British North America Act, the Royal Proclamation, that's the one I was thinking about. People love to use the Royal Proclamation. And it is one of the instruments of the doctrine of discovery. And it is a dangerous document to always cite. You know, people like to say, well, you know, the Royal Proclamation recognizes our rights, and all of that. But what it does do, it creates this principle that we only have the right to occupy and use the land. We don't have the right to own the land. That's what that begins to do. So that out of that grew this argument of terra nullius, which is a word, I believe it's a Latin word meaning empty land. And that was the British contribution to the doctrine of discovery. They declared everything in North America as empty. It's all empty land, even though we were living here, but because we were subhuman, we didn't have the right to possess the land or own the land. We were only occupying it and using it. Just like the deer, the buffalo, the moose, all the other critters that were wandering around here. That's the way they viewed us. So here we were. They were looking at us. They could see villages of our people, but they still considered us, this land is empty. And because it was empty, they had a right to take it. So Christianity or non-Christians were not deemed to have the same rights to land. And that was the other principle. Because we weren't Christian, we have no right to own land or to have sovereignty or self-determination. That's only for Christians. So that's one of their principles of the doctrine of discovery. So civilization or your American cultures were superior, and that's the way they viewed themselves and the way they represent themselves in the doctrine. So conquest is really another interesting argument because it becomes factual law as an element of discovery. So were we ever conquered as a people? I don't believe we were. We've had some good fights. We may not have won them all, but overall we were never conquered. We were never conquered as a people. And we should be proud of that fact. Because we can still kick butt today if we want to. But I think that's one of the things that we have to look at and remember, that this instrument, and there's lots of material that you need to take a look at in looking at the doctrine of discovery. And I've just kind of glazed over it. But there's lots of stuff, lots of history in there of how they developed their ethnocentric attitude and their idea, their way of thinking that they are better than all the other people in the world. And they approach everything in that way. So when they came here, that's exactly the way they looked at us. And when you're sitting in a meeting with them, that's exactly the way they look at you, even today. You know, so it is a challenge to always be confronting it. This is really the basis of the racism that exists as well. You know, and racism is still very prevalent in our world. In our communities, and outside of surrounding our communities. You know, when you look at all the settler towns around us, all of them, if they know it's an Indian coming into town, you know, you can experience their attitude. You know, and that's still very much there. So we're going to talk about decolonization. I mean, what does it really mean? So this is a process of decolonization. So the first one is to rediscover and recover our culture, which is really what we've been doing for the last 40 years. I would say up until the end of 1960s and into the 1970s, when everyone was getting inspired to be Ongwahome, and all the movement was going on, all of that stuff. There was a lot of action going on during that period of time. Wounded Knee. If you remember Wounded Knee in South Dakota, the Confederacy had a large contingency of people that were out there. I mean, we probably had a couple hundred people there, in and out of that action. I remember driving down with at least 100 people, and it was exciting, it was fun. And we were there because we wanted to exercise who we were. You remember all the bridge blockades, all that stuff was started late 1960s, 70s. It's because we were starting to feel who we were. We were starting to feel a sense of liberation about who we were. That we had a right to be who we were. We had certain rights that were guaranteed to us by treaty, by our own leadership, that we had a right to exercise those. And we attempted every chance we got to do that during that period of time.